I'm Raimond Gaita, probably known best to at least some of you as the author of Romulus, My Father. And I should have listened about what instructions we received before. Do I introduce you, David? Or do you introduce yourself too?
You should introduce me, Ray.
Yes, this is one of the cases where you say this is a man who needs no introduction, and that's true, and it's often said when it's not deservedly true, but in this case it already is. And we're here tonight to discuss his quarterly essay, and he's written, I think, an essay of extraordinary range and with a scholarship that's impressive but not at all oppressive or obtrusive. And to the contrary, it's a real pleasure reading him, reading some of his beloved authors in what looks to be a kind of conversation in a community of the living and the dead. And I'm sure nobody will be at all surprised to hear me say that it's beautifully written throughout. And David begins his essay with his beloved classical authors, Greek and Roman for the most part, and he tells us at the beginning of how their conception of happiness differs from ours, oversimplifying a little bit, but we'll take this up in conversation. Theirs, he says, was an objective conception, and ours tends to be much more subjective. And he says that that these two different conceptions of happiness are problematically related. And that shows in amongst other places, but this is a very dramatic and important place, in Thomas Jefferson's, I think David wants to call it felicitous confusion between the two senses, a felicitous confusion, perhaps an inspired confusion that had very dramatic and unforeseen consequences. And later, on the political theme, he comments on how the pursuit of the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers, led people who felt that they had to forsake happiness for themselves and to fight for it for future generations, how it led those people into terrible crimes last century. And he discusses, and we'll discuss this too, our changed attitudes to the body. And in a closing chapter, he considers our present form of restlessness and the way in which he believes it to be connected with, amongst other things, but very importantly, that the Earth has now become for us a planet amongst other planets. And he doesn't use the expression Mother Earth, but failing to see it anymore as people did when they used such an expression, he thinks shows itself amongst other things in an attitude that we have to the body, which is very different from an attitude that he celebrates when he writes beautifully about a poem by Rubens, and he'll be reading that out. But well, actually, maybe, if you wouldn't mind, we could start with your reading, on the one hand, your celebration of the Rubens painting, and then reading after that the section about where you write about the attitude that we now have to the body.
The Rubens painting is a painting he did very close to the end of his life. It's a painting of his second wife, whom he married when he was in his 50s and she was 16. And at the time when he painted her, she probably would have been 24. My particular interest in that is that it's very, very hard for us to present an image of someone in a state of real happiness. And this seemed to me to be something that brought us very, very close to somebody who is ecstatically happy in the world and in the flesh and with himself, and he is able to make that absolutely plain to us, because we have the image in front of us, but we also have him right there in the brushstrokes and in the response to the image. And that's useful because, Rubens is only 13 years younger than Shakespeare, and we know almost nothing about Shakespeare. And we know more about Rubens than almost anyone in his age, except a few princes, and that was because he was simply such a public figure and so well recorded. So it's amazing to see someone in this, whom we know in so many public ways, in this absolutely private moment. What makes a private work like Het Pelskine so precious and rare at this point in Rubens' career? It is that we know it is his hand and the energy of his mind and body that produced every brushstroke. The painting is the product not just of his vision, his powers of composition, but of his presence, as we know him, the man himself, from other more public occasions. Is that?
That's great. And would you mind now reading, just by contrast, the attitude you think we have to the body?
I'm of an age which means that I've been around in a century when technology changed everything faster than ever before. It's extraordinary to think that until probably the middle of the 18th century, nobody who was alive considered that the world they were living in was different from the world their grandfathers had lived in. Things changed so slowly that would not have been perceived by someone living at any moment. Things, of course, have speeded up till somebody of my age in his lifetime has seen enormous changes that are almost impossible to keep up with. I'm astonished when I look back on my own childhood how little the body as it existed in the 1930s and 1940s resembles the body as it is today. They were the years before antibiotics, penicillin, when people could still die by pricking their finger on a thorn, and women in large numbers lost their lives in childbirth. When an epidemic like the Spanish flu could kill millions all around the globe in just months, and a single polio summer, such as 1947, could leave thousands of children and young adults, if they did not immediately succumb, crippled for life. A time before organ transplants, dialysis machines, heart bypasses, chemo, before the pill, before MRIs, pap smears, ultrasounds, angiograms, before liposuction, breast implants, Botox, bionic ears, and the spread throughout the community of a rigorous devotion to all the varieties of self-care, as the body became a blank sheet to be worked on and improved and decorated. Diets, weights and aerobics, tattooing, waxing, piercing, the widespread phenomenon among teenagers of dental braces, and the cramming of pharmacy shelves with vitamin supplements, protein powders, and pills for maintaining friendly flora in the gut.
Well, I don't want to discuss that right now, but I do want to discuss it a little bit later. But I asked you to read it really because I thought that both passages were so wonderfully written and in very different tones and moods, I thought. But I thought we might start discussing your beloved classical authors, who strike me as a rather more varied bunch than. It's not that you won't allow, but there's, on the one hand, someone like Plato and Socrates who are very intense, and on the other hand, someone like Aristotle and Seneca, who were incredibly urbane. In fact, Bertrand Russell, in his history of Western philosophy, was famously unjust to Aristotle, but that was partly because he couldn't bear his urbanity, and he thought it was a man of no passion whatsoever, which I think is not entirely true, but there's some important truth in it. But I was struck by the way in which you wanted to start with your classical authors, because it reminded me of a remark by a philosopher called Bernard Williams, who sort of playing on a joke that had been current in Eastern Europe during the time of communism. And that joke was that communism is the longest route between capitalism and capitalism. And he said Christianity, it has turned out, is the longest route between paganism and paganism, and that now that Christianity no longer has the kind of influence that it has on our moral thinking that it did even, let's say, 100 years ago. We are, in all sorts of ways, turning back to the Greeks in order to understand ourselves, not just as a scholarly historical interest. And it seems to me that's what you're doing, that I think, forgive me if I've got you wrong, but it seemed to me that one of the things you're saying is we will understand better the attitude that we have to the body of the kind that you read out in that second reading, if we understand, amongst other things, the way in which they took happiness to be, as you put it, an objective condition, rather than as we do as a primarily subjective one. Is that right?
I suppose that is so, except that one of the things that I'm quite interested in, and that comes out of, is that the word happiness is a very strange word in English, because until about the middle of the 18th century, we would have thought of it in terms of its derivation. And there are words like happening, like hapless, like mishap, and all of those are words about material conditions. And so happiness was very close to the word fortune. And so a person was happy, as when we say it was a happy circumstance, or happily this happened or didn't happen. So happy really referred not to an interior state at all, but to an exterior state of good fortune. And then I think they noticed that people who were fortunate also exhibited well-being. And so the word happiness got transformed and took on the sense of well-being and of feeling well about yourself and about the world. So it was partly that contrast that led me to the difference between happiness as seen as a more materialistic thing, or as we tend to see it, as a state of mind, as a state of soul. I think that when we look at classical attempts to achieve happiness, I think they felt, as we probably don't, that you could be schooled in that. And, a lot of the classical schools, as Martha Nussbaum calls it, were places where you indulged in the therapy of desire, is the word she uses. But what you set out to do was free yourself of vulnerability to circumstance. And you detached yourself from the world. And I don't really think that kind of detachment from the world, which you also get in some forms of Oriental philosophy, I don't think that is quite what we are interested in.
No, certainly. No, that's an understatement. It's true that it seems to me that the word eudaimonia, which is often the word used and in Greek, could you could substitute fortunate. I mean, but we still in English are able to say things like happy is the person who, and then elaborate in ways that don't necessarily refer to their subjective states whatsoever. So we have no difficulty in understanding, it seems to me, someone who says happy is the person who can go to their grave. Well, you could echo the words of the Egyptian prayer for the dead, not having made anybody weep, not having harmed anybody, etc. And that's still a perfectly familiar way of using the word happy, it seems to me. And I don't know if I would agree that it was a purely objective state for the Greeks, because, I mean, certainly in the case of, let's say, someone like Aristotle, being in that fortunate condition was one that it seemed to me a right-thinking person would appreciate and take great joy in.
Yeah, the slight difficulty with it that I have with all of that is that they were bound to think that, because the people who were thinking about such things, and certainly the people who were inhabiting those schools, were privileged. They belonged to a privileged class. They were men of status, so they already had the good fortune to be able to then consider what a good life might be. They had already what we think of as the good life, which means the fortunate life.
But not quite in that way, because I mean, for Aristotle, for example, the good life was the virtuous life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's certainly true that to live the kind of virtuous life that he wanted, that is a life essentially where you could do great deeds that would be admired by your peers. I mean, it's a very interesting thing about that period, actually, that unlike a post-Christian world, they thought that people could, without shame whatsoever, live in the deserved esteem of their peers and bask in it. But still, though it was true for the particular conception that he had of what would count as the good or the happy life, if one takes from it, as so many modern philosophers have taken from it, the idea that it's virtue that constitutes it, you could then substitute that to a much more egalitarian conception of things, and still say the good life. Or you could still then say happy is the person who, and then elaborate that in terms of the person who's lived a virtuous life. And thinking that you wouldn't prize that virtuous life if a person couldn't take pleasure in it. So it's not just an accidental connection that it was external good fortune and a sense of well-being essential to the idea, I think as they thought it, was that a person who saw clearly the kind of life she was living would take great pleasure and even joy in it.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you were speaking before about why I was interested in particularly the later classical world and why it seems particularly useful to us, is it seems to me that if you look at that period, say from the accession of Trajan through to the death of Marcus Aurelius, I mean, that is absolutely a golden period in which the empire was mostly at peace, except for a few wars on the edge, where the state was extraordinarily well run, where they had begun to realize that one of the things that made it possible for you to run a decent state was that you had to have the economy in order. They also realized that one of the things that made it a decent state was you had to start giving citizenship and equality to all sorts of people. So Roman citizenship was extended to almost everybody in the empire as long as they were willing to swear certain kinds of things. Rights were extended in an enormously interesting way to women. And that is the time when, for example, one of the greatest of the philosophers in the schools is an ex-slave, that's Epictetus. It seems to me that that is a period when we look back, which is concerned with something like the same things that we're concerned with. How do you hold a big state together? How do you manage an economy? How do you see that justice begins to work in the state? And it's also the time when people are taking on literary and philosophical questions which are very like ours. Now, the 19th century generally saw all of that as merely decadent. We've begun to see it not as decadent at all because we understand it from inside. And that's a period that I'm particularly interested in. And, I didn't mention somebody who in that period would be perhaps my favourite of all those classical writers, and that's Plutarch.
Well, keeping on the political theme that you touched, and this is something we talked about on the phone, and I'm interested in following through. It has to do with a suspicion I have that the things that you talk about and give us great insight into, that the concept of happiness is not adequate to them. Actually, that's it. So let me start off with the idea of the pursuit of the greatest happiness. The pursuit of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which was a theme of utilitarianism, of course. An Australian philosopher, Jack Smart, once said, when as always happens when people discuss, well, what is happiness, etc., etc., he said, look, what's really at issue here is the alleviation of misery. Is the alleviation of misery. Yeah. And he said the really driving force for these philosophers, the utilitarian philosophers, who talk so often about the greatest happiness or the greatest number, the really driving force was compassion. And in fact, Jack Smart said, Bentham said at one stage, the founder of utilitarianism, said, don't ask whether it thinks, ask whether it suffers. That's the important thought. And in this connection, if you're connected with the crimes that you were talking about, that these people, in one way or another, instigated, I'm reminded again of Hannah Arendt, who talked about, she called it the passion of, she was talking about Robespierre actually, the passion of compassion, which she said had a capacity for cruelty greater than cruelty itself. And she instanced in another connection a modern writer, Brecht, who said, thinking of Stalin, supporting Stalin, said, sink down into the slime, embrace the butcher, but change the world. So I'm wondering there whether, though the slogan constantly was the greatest happiness, the greatest number, and the pursuit of happiness and so on, whether the real work concepts that were doing the work was a compassionate need to alleviate misery.
Well, I think that even when Jefferson first said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is really the beginning of all of that notion that happiness might be one of the rights that everyone would have. He would have been thinking in 18th century terms where happiness was exactly that, the absence of the conditions of misery. And so if you thought of that as a project, and that would mean the removal of things like injustice, homelessness, unemployment, starvation, inequality under the law. They are all the things which are things you can legislate for. And you do all of that. That's part of the project of making people universally happy. And that is in some ways what we have achieved. We'd have to say, when we look around, that we're well housed, well fed, well clothed. We don't have to worry about famines any longer. We don't have to worry about pestilence. That is exactly the point at which you have done everything you possibly can to make people not miserable. That is the point at which they must learn now to be positively happy. And that's the problem. And the question I ask is, why, when we are living in a state where, for most of us, certainly in the society we live in, and there's not the whole world, of course, all the things that might make us miserable have been removed, why are we still in a state of anxiety, stress? Why do we feel we have not got what we really wanted? Why, in a world where excess is the norm, do we keep feeling that there is more and we haven't got it? That's really, in some ways, where I begin, because people in the past would have looked at the world we're living in and say, these people have achieved paradise. They're living the lives of angels. Why don't we feel like that?
Well, the reason that, yes, but you see, there are two ways one can go here. One can say, look, it's obvious why we want to relieve misery, because people want to be happy, right? And that's why else would we want to relieve their misery? But someone might say, no, look, we need to relieve their misery because they're miserable, and when they're not, when they have enough to eat and all the rest of it, they can decide what matters to them in life. And it may not be the case that they will think that what matters most to them, most in life, is to the pursuit of happiness. For one thing, I might say that everybody knows that the way to ensure that you won't be happy is to pursue happiness. That's one thing. But thinking less practically, they might say, as the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl wrote, he said that what he had discovered in his therapeutic practice was that what people really sought was not happiness but meaning in their lives. And that's why I raised this big question over this conversation, whether happiness is the concept that you really want, to explore why it is that we're so anxious, discontented, or as you put it, restless.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I'm thinking of is in terms of that Jeffersonian project, if that's what he actually had in mind, that the idea was that you provided people with, by removing all of those things, with the conditions of happiness, for being happy, for pursuing happiness. But perhaps those are not really the necessary conditions at all of happiness. And that if happiness is a belief that you are at one with the world you live in and with yourself and with your neighbours, and that would be one of the ways in which one might define happiness, those conditions really in the end, even when they've been achieved, have nothing to do with it. So the question is, what is it that we have achieved along the way that makes life difficult for us? There are other conditions now, and what are those conditions that make us, as I said, anxious, unsafe, powerless, whatever it is?
Well, I think if I understand you, I think one answer that you give is that we're now, despite that concern for the body that you read out before, there's a very deep way in which we're alienated from the body, because the concern for it has become mindless in the literal sense. Sorry, more or less in the literal sense of the word, because we now the concept of the mind as distinct from the brain, for example, is becoming very attenuated for us. People actually say things like, my brain thinks that such and such, or it's my brain my brain feels that such and such, rather than I think so and so, or I feel such and such. And so in that sense, if I've understood you, you wanted to say that there have been all sorts of developments, both in science and in technology, that are alienating us from a deeply intimate relationship to our bodies.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I've got some sort of idea that our relationship to our body and our body's relationship to the world is a lot more primitive still than the rest of what we have created. And that is that, and that's why I go back to that idea, that Greek idea from Protagoras, that man is the measure of all things, but everything both begins and ends in a kind of way with what is within the body's reach. And I think back to, for example, when 25 years ago now, I went to live in a village in Italy, and I was living for the very first time with people in 1978 who might still have been in 1378 or even 378. And what I mean by that is they were highly sophisticated people. This was Tuscany. I realized, first of all, that although I was in one of the great centers of Christendom, these people were not Christians and never really had been. They were, in fact, pagans. What they worshipped was the olive trees, and what sacrament meant for them was sitting down each day at lunch with the family, and this is where the idea of the sacrament comes from. You know, sitting at a table and eating the food that they'd grown. There was that. Most of them had never been more than 10 kilometres from the village, which was the place where they had been born. They looked at the little village that was on the hill opposite as if it were the other side of Mars. And I realised that if you lived like that, and these people were living, that huge numbers of the people still on the planet live that way, and that it's not really all that long ago that we lived that way too. And again, coming back to live in Sydney, I really also realised that one of the things I did, because I don't have a car, and because I don't have to commute to work, was that in fact, although I lived in a big city, I really lived in about 2 kilometres in any direction. That's how far I went any day and any week. And I think perhaps that is how we feel most comfortable. But we've created a world in which our mind lives somewhere quite different from that. And technology has made it so that we now have this enormous grasp of things. We can actually look at our own planet on a screen and see ourselves out there in space somewhere. We know how far we can look into the universe, and it's millions and millions of light years away. Or we can also look on a screen inside ourselves, as I did the other night on television, and watch a malaria virus invading a human cell. So, you know, we've got this enormous reach of the mind, but we're still left with the same body. And maybe the body still thinks in the same kind of way about what it is comfortable with. And I think that's a source of real anxiety to us.
Well, I work in a philosophy department in London, which is in my judgment, very scientific, not just scientifically oriented, but scientific in its conception of things. And I don't think it's just because I spent some time there that I have a sense that many people now are very open to the thought that the body is merely the means which we have thus far been able to do things. It's essentially been an instrument. And they think, well, look, thoughts are brain processes as things stand. And they think if you believe that is, if you think there are no immaterial substances or immaterial events, then one thing you should recognise is that there are other things that could be producing the thoughts other than the stuff that's actually in the brain. It could be the stuff that goes into computers, for example. Because if all that matters is that the brain is what enables you to think and have sensations, etc., why couldn't we do that in some other material form? And I have a feeling that this thought has captured not just the imaginations of philosophy students in King's College London. Because I told you on the telephone, I spoke once with a man who makes robots. This was at Adelaide, the Festival of Ideas at MIT. And he said the really interesting question is not when we will be able to make them like us. When will we make ourselves like them? And you just have to extend the thought. You have plastic hips, you have this. We hope that when someone's in an accident, their brain damage, that we can replace those parts that will enable them to remember, to think, etc., not necessarily in flesh and blood. So here, that seems to me that there's now, it's not just science fiction, but there is a really imaginative sense that the body, the flesh and blood body was only the means by which we human beings, the species Homo sapiens, has thus far been able to think, etc., and have sensations, sexual sensations, which presumably could be stimulated in some other sort of ways. I know this sounds grotesque, but
no, look, I'm prepared to admit that we are very, very flexible creatures, and that we may evolve all sorts of ways and eventually feel comfortable with all of that. But I just wonder whether what you're describing is something that most of us feel is enlarging and enlivening, or whether it seems threatening.
Well, I think the people I'm describing think that we're scared of it at the moment, but we ought to be open to it being enlarging, because they say that's just how it is. They say this is something we have now learned about the body. Yeah. It is in principle dispensable.
Well, it does really raise the question, which I wanted to raise in the essay altogether, whether the pace of technology and the momentum with which these things are happening are ones that we can actually keep up with. And I think that's one of the things that makes us fearful. We're excited by the technology and we throw ourselves into using it, but we also, somewhere, when we lie down to sleep or in our dreams or somewhere else, we are still that heavy-boned creature who can't see more than, 150 feet and can't move faster than 4 kilometres an hour or something, what it is when we're walking.
Well, I'm with you entirely on this, you see, but the question then is who's the we that you've been talking about?
Yeah, exactly, and as I say, I'm open to the idea, and I again say there in the essay that it's not for me or my generation to be able to grasp what a new generation is going to be able to deal with. But the question is there, and for me, it's scary.
Well, it is. It is worth putting what they have to deal with, actually, because it's. I heard someone say just recently, for example, that he has a friend who seriously intends not to die. That is, I think he hopes maybe to put himself on ice.
A very scary prospect.
But it seemed to me, let's go back to your classical people. I mean, they called human beings the mortals. Mm-hmm. It was as though that were part of the definition of what it was to be a human being. And it was an expression that already carries an accent of pity. it was a sorrowing sense of what is essential to the human condition.
But that hasn't changed, has it?
I think a lot of people think that it is. I think there's one conception that thinks that it's somehow utterly essential to our sense of what is to be human, that we're mortal beings, vulnerable to suffering, vulnerable to misfortune, on the one hand. And there are people who say, yes, we happen to be such beings, but maybe technology will change that. And it's in no sense part, it shouldn't be, these people will say, shouldn't be in any sense part of our self-definition as human beings. I wonder how
old these people are. I mean, why I say that is it's true, and we know it's true, that young men, for example, are incapable of fully conceiving the idea that they're going to die. And that's why they take terrible risks and why they go off to wars and things. Eventually, we come to believe in our own mortality, not because somebody convinces of it in argument, but because when we get to a certain age, we have bodies which keep telling us this bit is dying. This bit is no longer functions as it once did. And that's, it happens slowly, and but it's pretty convincing. And it's the body that tells us that. We don't learn it even from what's happened to others. That's not convincing.
But you see, the person who was described as seriously intending not to die knows that only too well. That's why he seriously intends not to die. But I mean, I do think this. I think there are two very different attitudes here. One is that thinks it's somehow essential to the human condition that we're mortal beings. The other that says, regretfully, it happens to be how things are with us. Let's hope that they might change. And these seem to me radically different perspectives. And the second perspective has taken on some kind of reality in people's imaginations because they think technology can do marvels.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a radical and new idea, though, isn't it? I mean, I in the essay talk about Condorcet, who really was the first person to come up with the notion that progress was what everything was all about, and that man was in the end perfectible. Again, a pretty. But this is to go absolutely beyond that, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'd be interested to see if there are people in the audience who feel this is now part of people's serious imagining of the human condition, or whether it's a kind of fanciful piece of science fiction.